Professor Andrew Erskine is a professor of ancient history at Edinburgh University in Scotland, specializing in Hellenistic and Roman periods. His research interests encompass Hellenistic monarchies, Roman imperialism, Alexander the Great's legacy, oratory in Rome, and the influence of ancient philosophy on politics. Erskine has authored books like Plutarch, Hellenistic Lives, and edited volumes such as Ancient Greek History. His work helps deepen our understanding of the ancient Mediterranean world. And for today, he's been so kind to accept my invitation to discuss a very famous Cypriot philosopher that I'm sure most listeners are familiar with, named Zeno of Citium. Thank you, Andrew, for accepting my invitation.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be talking to you.
Awesome. Listeners to this podcast know that I almost always start off with talking about sources. And Zeno, we know him basically from one particular source. Do you mind just telling us how we know him biographically?
Yeah, Zeno is he's a philosopher from Kition, and our main sort of knowledge of his life, I suppose, comes from a work by a writer called Diogenes Laertius. Now, Diogenes Laertius, we don't really know much about him, lives in roughly 3rd century AD, so a long time after Zeno. We're talking, 500-600 years. And he writes a work, The Lives of Eminent Philosophers, which goes through sort of all the main philosophers of antiquity. Book 7 focuses on Stoic philosophers and begins with a life of Zeno. Now, what Diogenes does is he gives some information about the life and then sort of the main philosophical ideas of a particular philosopher. So much of the life of Zeno consists of summaries of that philosophy. It's not always clear how well Diogenes understands the philosophy he's describing, but he is a valuable source for the lives of these philosophers, and he has quite a bit to say about Zeno. Much of it is sort of anecdotes, and so we have to be quite wary about using some of this material.
Is there any unanimity on Zeno's origins?
That's actually quite a tricky question. He comes from Kition, which, in the period which we're talking about, 4th century BC, is for most of the 4th century BC, is ruled by Phoenicians, a Phoenician dynasty. The population seems to be a mixed Greek-Phoenician population, and Zeno himself, in our sources, is often described as Phoenician, but there is not really sort of, I think it's probably not agreement on whether he was Phoenician or Greek. It's very difficult to say, because his name and his father's name, Zeno or Zenon, son of Menesius, is very Greek. At the same time, we have sources that describe him as a Phoenician, as from Phoenicia. So it could be that he is from a Greek family in Kition, but people in mainland Greece, people looking, associate that place with Phoenicians, and it's just a way of sort of identifying him, because he comes from there. But it may, on the other hand, be that he was Phoenician. It does mean, I think, that he comes from a different kind of background than any someone living in mainland Greece, or a normal Athenian or something like that. He probably can imagine he's probably bilingual, and I do think also that a place like even Cyprus as a whole in that period of the 4th century is going to be very different from Athens. It has a completely different kind of historical sort of backstory. It would be, Cyprus ruled by Persians, and then once Alexander's come onto the scene, the Persian Empire collapses. Then maybe for a while Cyprus in a bit of a limbo, and then the successors start fighting over Cyprus. So it's not living the same kind of life as people in mainland Greece.
I recall reading something along, maybe it's in Diogenes, that they referred to Zeno as an Egyptian vine, something along those lines, referencing his height, which I
Mhm.
think he was considered to be particularly tall, but also his like swarthiness.
Yes.
He had dark features. But you know what? I almost think that's a little bit irrelevant and anachronistic for us to view it in these terms, because Zeno himself and most people of the time, they wouldn't have seen themselves in the terms that I'm using now, like his ethnicity. They would have likely identified themselves simply by their polis, if I'm not mistaken.
They would do, yes. Although even if we think about it in those terms, I mean, if it's ruled, I mean, it's ruled by sometimes referred to as a king. I mean, Kition sometimes referred to as being ruled by a king. Um, so it might be rather different from a polis on the Greek mainland, um, and that again also might affect the way Zeno's later thinking about politics as well. But I suppose that the point is that he did think about himself as coming from Kition, and that point comes out sort of quite clearly in the way. I mean, at one point we're told Diogenes says about him. Um, he gives money towards he contributes money, I think, towards the baths, restoring the baths or something like that in Athens, and his name is inscribed because a benefactor would normally be inscribed on stone in a list of benefactors. As he's going to be inscribed as Zenon the philosopher, and he asks them to add Zeno of Citium, uh, so that he identified as being a person from Kition.
So, what does Diogenes tell us about his life? I mean, when does he arrive in Athens? Do we have any information about his time in Cyprus even before that?
We don't really have much information about Cyprus. We have what I said about kind of his sense of loyalty to it. He may, and we know that he is later honoured with a statue in Cyprus. So whether that means that he continued to maintain links, he probably did maintain links, but that's not something that enters our rather sort of scattered source material about him. He's described as being the son of a merchant, as and Cyprus in this period, uh, important sort of trading center, and of course you get that trading between the Levant, Cyprus, and then into the Aegean. So his family seems to have been involved in that kind of area, and the sources that tell us about him coming to Athens tend to focus on him coming for that for reasons associated with that. I suppose we might say that. I mean, well, the stories that we have, they can be quite elaborated about how he comes there. They're kind of origin stories. You know what I mean? Um, explaining explaining how he got there, explaining how the philosophy first began, um, as if they need a origin story, an idea. Um, whether or not how where the truth lies is another matter. So, for instance, I mean, Diogenes focuses on quite a dramatic story at the beginning of his life of Zeno. That Zeno is coming to Athens on a trading mission, bringing, I think he's bringing purple from Phoenicia, and his ship gets wrecked. Coincidentally, it seems to get wrecked exactly when he gets to Athens, which leaves him kind of stranded in Athens, and he goes to a bookshop, sort of ancient equivalent of a bookshop, and picks out a work which turns out to be Xenophon's memorabilia, um, and gets absorbed in this work, and then asks the bookshop keeper, where can I find someone like this? And by chance, the cynic philosopher Crates is walking past, and the bookshop owner says, "There's your man." So he follows him. But the ship
Yeah.
was wrecked. He wasn't on it. That sounds a bit more reasonable, I suppose. So he turned to philosophy, or the story that he was just coming to Athens and decided to stay, um, which is not so exciting as a story for the origins of Stoicism. So, and maybe for that reason, might actually be the most plausible.
So, what were the major tenets of cynicism that kind of drew Zeno to Crates in the first place? And obviously, we'll talk about how it may or may not have influenced Stoicism?
Cynicism is interesting philosophy. I mean, we can be kind of these terms for these philosophies, cynicism, Stoicism, Epicureanism. They all have meanings in modern English which have rather shifted away from what their original meaning is. So, I mean, cynicism is not necessarily what we think of when we use the word cynicism. I just think we need to sort of be clear about that at the beginning. But cynicism is a philosophy that is essentially kind of anti-convention. Crates was a pupil of a philosopher, Diogenes, Diogenes of Sinope, a city on the Black Sea. And Diogenes and Crates, in their presentation of their philosophy, they rejected convention. So they said you should live according to nature. And that living according to nature is important when we come to Stoicism. But living according to nature meant rejecting all sorts of things about modern or contemporary Greek society. So, for instance, rejection of political authority, which comes out in that story. There's a story about Diogenes sort of sitting on the ground somewhere, I forget where, and Alexander the Great comes along and says to him, what kind of benefaction can I give you? What can I do for you? And Diogenes' response is just to say, well, can you move out of my light? Move out of the sunlight. So disregard for political authority. And the other thing which is important in cynicism, for its later influence in particular, I think, is Diogenes that rejects the polis. So because it's rejecting convention, and all the things to do with the polis are matters of convention. So he would say, a citizen not of the polis but of the cosmos, of the cosmopolis. So the idea of a cosmopolis emerges. And also in rejecting convention, they can adopt sort of what you might consider sort of shock tactics. And Diogenes notorious for public masturbation, and saying he wished he could solve his hunger by rubbing his stomach. So cynicism then adopts a rejection. So it's quite negative. It's not really constructing something. It's not putting something positive forward. It's pushing things away. And they would say that they would stress is living according to nature, and that is how you will get happiness, what's called eudaimonia. And if you look at philosophies of the 4th century, there's great stress on eudaimonia, happiness, and this is the sort of end goal of life. And the question is how to achieve it. And it's normally seen as being achieved by virtue in some way or another. And in the case of the Cynics, that good life is achieved by getting rid of all these conventional things.
Would we say that cynicism had an influence, a direct influence on the development of Stoicism later?
Yeah, it has an influence, particularly in this sort of stress on a natural life. This stress on the good life, on eudaimonia, achieved through living a natural life. I mean, the Stoics take that idea and what would be called a life according to reason, so a rational. Stoics are very keen on reason and rationality, and they would give the kind of Cynic life a kind of more positive spin. So they start to try and build out from it and construct. So instead of negativity, you get a positive life. But that also means where the Cynics are rejecting participation, the polis and so on, the Stoics are willing to engage with it.
I might be jumping a little bit ahead here. So, like, how do we understand Stoicism then? Like, what are its tenets? And at least in its early form, at least in what we can reconstruct.
Maybe the thing to do is to talk about Zeno's most controversial work, which is his Republic or Politeia. And also, I need to say something about the difficulties of why it's difficult for us to sort of understand Stoicism, early Stoicism in particular. I mean, if we want to read, if we want to know what Plato thought or Aristotle thought, we can go and read Plato's Republic or Aristotle's Ethics or whatever. But one of the problems with Zeno, I mean, Zeno is an enormously influential philosopher, but we don't have what he wrote. And I think that's important to sort of be clear about that and establish that. His writings are lost. So in trying to know what he thought and what early Stoics thought, we have to reconstruct it. And just to give you a sense of the problem here, one of the most influential Stoics in the 3rd century BC, a man called Chrysippus of Soloi, he's said to have written over 700 works. But none of these works survive. What we have is later people, probably writing as many as 200-300 years later, explaining what Chrysippus said. Or, in the case of someone like Plutarch, attacking what Chrysippus said. And then we have to try and work out what he actually said from the attacks. This is a fundamental problem in understanding early 3rd century Stoicism. If we're looking at Seneca, much later, a famous Stoic philosopher and politician, we have Seneca's writings, so we know what Seneca said and thought, but that doesn't necessarily tell us what a 3rd century BC Stoic was thinking and arguing. And I mean, we have other writings where we have what's called doxographical writings. These are summaries of Stoic thought, but they don't necessarily summarize a particular Stoic. It's just maybe the whole body of Stoic thought and merging various different Stoics into one. So these are the problems we face when we're looking at Zeno, who is, he creates the philosophy, but later writers maybe add in lots of elements which maybe he didn't actually think about at the time. Anyway, so I was saying that the most famous of his works is a work called The Republic, the Politeia, and this is certainly the most cited of all his works. But there are problems with the Republic in that Stoics, later Stoics, they seem to be a bit embarrassed about it. They said either it was a very early work, so it wasn't really a kind of mainstream, wasn't really what mainstream Zenos thought. It was kind of early, sort of young man's piece of work before he got serious. And they would describe it as being written on the dog's tail, the dog being the Cynics, so heavily influenced by Cynics. And we can see that they had problems with it because a Stoic philosopher who was also a librarian in Pergamon in Asia Minor is said to have censored it. He cut out the bits which he thought were inappropriate. So we have this controversial work. It's not always clear the nature of the controversy was. It seems that the work attacked contemporary society. That's one of the things it did. And Zeno was a man who, we can tell from the anecdotes in Diogenes, was very blunt. He didn't sort of, if he didn't like something, he would just make it absolutely clear. So it attacked contemporary society. Follows cynicism in rejecting various components of the polis, like law courts, gymnasia, marriage. It offers a sexually liberated community. And in much of it, sort of, one can see similarities with Plato's Republic as well. Although Plato's Republic maybe didn't get such criticism, but clearly some of the ways in which he expressed these things were not felt to merit the sort of approval of later Stoics. And it may be that in some ways it was quite sort of revolutionary in its idea of what a city should be. And later Stoics became rather more conservative and they weren't comfortable with this. So there's a Cynic influence, but it's also a response in some ways to Plato's Republic. And Zeno taught by Crates, but he's also taught by Platonic philosophers, particularly a man called Polemon in the Academy. So in his work, there are various influences, and it's important not to see him as just influenced by cynicism, but someone who listened to lots of different philosophers in Athens, and Athens was a great place to listen to philosophers.
I'm curious how Stoicism compares to Epicureanism, only because, at least in my experience, Epicureanism is presented as sort of the antithesis to Stoicism. Well, I mean, maybe you can speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, they're contemporaries. Possibly, I think Zeno is maybe just a little younger than Epicurus. They're working in Athens at roughly the same time, and so they're following on from the same kind. I mean, they're following on from Plato, Aristotle, the main philosophers in Athens in the 4th century. A difference, I suppose, just is that Epicurus is a man who is an Athenian citizen. He comes from, he comes from outside Athens, but he is a Athenian citizen, and so maybe he feels more kind of integrated into the city in some ways. The Epicureans, and maybe one should think about sort of contrasts in various ways. I mean, if you went to Athens and you wanted to listen to Zeno, you would go to the Agora, the center of Athens, and someone would point out to you that you'd probably find Zeno talking to people in the Stoa Poikile, the painted Stoa. And there in the painted Stoa, you would see Zeno, maybe with a group of people around him. So in the heart of the city. That's why they're called the Stoics,
right?
exactly, because Zeno began in that Stoa.
Right.
Epicurus, on the other hand, if you wanted to find Epicurus and you went and asked someone, they would point you out of the city. And Epicurus, in his garden on the outskirts of the city or just outside the city walls, would have his group of pupils, disciples, or whatever, there in this land which he owned. And this, because he was a citizen, he was entitled to own land, whereas Zeno wasn't in that position. But it might also say something about how these two men approached political life. Zeno, part of the city, talking to people in the city, in Agora, is like a focal point of the city, political, religious, economic center. Epicurus moving outside it, separate from it. In terms of their philosophy, their sort of goal, I mean, both of them offer a kind of integrated philosophy. A system, in that Zeno and Stoics that follow him believed that the different parts of philosophy, logic, ethics, physics, are interrelated. And Epicureans would have the same kind of idea too, but how they compose that is different. I mean, Epicurus has a big stress on physics and the atomic structure of things, which is an approach which the Stoics wouldn't have. In ethical terms, the kind of life they would expect people to lead in terms of what's good in some ways similar, but an Epicurean wouldn't be expected to take part in political life in the way in which Zeno and Stoics seem to think was appropriate. In the case of Epicureans, although their goal is eudaimonia as well, and living a virtuous life, one of the obstacles to that is stress and anxiety, and so you want to avoid that kind of thing, and therefore it makes more sense to avoid the kind of things that cause stress, like a political life. Whereas Stoics would say to be for eudaimonia, for happiness, the only thing that you really need to be happy is to be good and to be virtuous. So other things like pain, stress, health, wealth, they're nice to have, but they're not a component of your well-being in the sense of your happiness and being virtuous. So one of the striking things about Stoic thought is that these things are valuable but not essential, and that kind of idea of which we have of Stoics as sort of being unperturbed by things comes from this kind of idea.
Believe there's an epigram from one Zenodotus who talks about Zeno's self-sufficiency and casting aside wealth.
Yeah,
And that's a quote that I should put in quotations. So what are we inferring from that then? Is that a part? Is that a really significant part of Stoicism as well, to be quote unquote Stoic in our modern sense of the word? Where you live by bare means, so to speak.
it's an interesting question, because I mean, what we do see, I think, is that, I mean, if you look at Plato and Aristotle, then what you have is very much sort of people thinking about the nature of the world and so on, and that's certainly the case also in Stoicism, in that they are interested in analyzing the world and interested in analyzing nature of language, all sorts of things. But I mean, what you're getting at in the question, I think, is, does it also kind of ebb into talking about a way of life? And this does seem, yeah, and of course Zenodotus is writing, well, I think he's sort of second half of the 2nd century, so he's not, I mean, he's writing sometime after 150 years after Zeno. But that kind of cynicism also sort of suggests an overlap between a philosophical view and a way of life, which does seem to come into early Stoics, although it's always difficult to tell whether what we have is later people trying to look at the early Stoics and find that way of life there. So Cleanthes, the successor of Zeno, is very much presented as being sort of a man who sort of is out there working as well as doing philosophy. But yeah, I think we are seeing a sort of shift into stressing a way of life as well, and that's something that becomes therefore much more prominent when we get to some of the Roman Stoics, like Seneca or Marcus Aurelius.
Right. Zeno, he had a number of pupils, including a Persaeus of Citium, which, having spoken to you earlier, this was news to me. I had no idea about Persaeus, who would later become part of the court of the Macedonian king in the period. But the sources are a bit silent on him, but he sounds like a very interesting character. Do you mind talking to us a little bit about who Persaeus is?
Yeah, Persaeus, I mean, the most likely explanation about him almost is that he's from Kition. He was a pupil of Zeno. How he comes to be in Athens with Zeno, we're not entirely clear. I mean, maybe there's family connections, we don't know. But he really kind of emerges when, at one point, the Macedonian king Antigonus Gonatus asks Zeno to come to his court in Macedon, and Zeno declines, but he sends 2 of his pupils, one of whom is Persaeus. And Persaeus goes to the court. There are actually a number of sort of anecdotes about him at the court, like at life at court. And I think, again, we need to sort of think about the nature of Hellenistic world at this point, because I mean, what we have is these kingdoms which have sort of grown out of Alexander the Great's empire, and so Macedon would be sort of following on from Alexander's Macedon, but elsewhere you have kings in Egypt, the Ptolemaic kings in Egypt, you have the Seleucid kings in Asia Minor. So they all have courts, and in these courts they will have sort of groups of sort of elite soldiers, people from cities in their kingdom, and they will have intellectuals. And we find that in all of these courts. So it's part of the kind of credibility of the court to have these intellectuals there. And Antigonus has various different sort of intellectuals at court, poets as well as philosophers. So Persaeus goes there, and when these people are associated with the king, they can also be used in various roles. They could be used as ambassadors and this kind of thing. Persaeus is said to have acted as a some kind of administrator in mainland Greece at the Acrocorinth. So quite a varied kind of life he would have been leading. At the court, we get the impression that he's sort of close to the king, but there's rivalry between people, and things can be quite tense sometimes at court, I think. He writes. What do we know that he writes various books which go under various names, but then the essential idea seems to be symposium memoirs, and those stories, although those accounts, seem to tell us quite a lot about life at court. He has lots of examples from the life at court, and they are recorded. I mean, again, these works are lost, but the stories he tells are recorded in later writers.
You talk about how, and I have a quote here, strikingly mobile Persaeus is. What sort of trajectory does his life take before he sort of makes his way to Macedon?
Well, I mean, by mobile, I'm thinking really just about he's someone starts off in Cyprus, he goes to Athens, he goes to Macedon, and then he's down in the Peloponnese. This is not someone who is a philosopher who's just going to Athens and just spending his life in Athens. Or, I mean, most people are going to be spending their life just in a single polis, whereas he's moving around. He's probably becoming quite wealthy through his association with the Macedonian king. I mean, those people who are at the court, who are close to the king, they did profit from it.
You mentioned that the Macedonian court, or just court life in general, could be filled with intrigues. Did Persaeus have conflicts or rivalries of sorts while he was serving in Macedonia?
Well, the main one we hear about is with a man called Menedemos of Eritrea, who wanted to sort of get the king's support for certain political changes he wanted to have brought about in his hometown. And as far as we can see, Persaeus not very keen on this at all. Maybe because he felt that this was if the king did this was his king showing favor to someone, so another philosopher at court. So that's the kind of, I suppose, rivalry which we might get as these men sort of struggle for the attention of the king. I mean, this and Menedemos clearly didn't get on with Persaeus. He describes him as a philosopher. He may well be, but he is the worst of men who live or have ever lived.
It's pretty harsh.
Yeah.
And why do we know? Do we have any idea as to why he would get those type of comments? I believe, if I'm not mistaken, I read that Persaeus' life was somewhat at odds with the tenets of Stoicism.
Yeah, well, there's sort of a sense that which comes out in our sources that he's a Stoic philosopher, but he's maybe a little bit more concerned about wealth and prestige and this kind of thing than the theory should suggest. Then again, of course, this kind of thinking relates to the idea of, are you a philosopher who is supposed to be just arguing and thinking about things, or is it actually supposed to affect your life and the way in which you lead your life? And certainly if you're taking it that point of view, then Persaeus is not really following that line, but probably quite difficult to do if you're at a court and there's all these banquets and there's wealth and you're being given land and this kind of thing. Quite a contrast then to Zeno, who eschews wealth, who not very keen on going to banquets and this kind of thing, and when he goes there, he normally seems to be rude to people.
Finally, Zeno, we know from at least the works of Diogenes, he eventually will meet his end. What do we know about Zeno's death? Because it's very fascinating story that we hear. Can you just recount that for listeners?
It's a little mystery, a bit of a mystery actually. It's he's supposed to be about the age at which he dies sort of varies a little bit, but I think in all accounts he's over 70. One account he starves himself to death, and in another he falls and I think he breaks his toe and sort of thumps his hands on the ground and says something. He quotes, I think it's a play, maybe Euripides, saying that sort of I'm coming, sort of I know my time is up, and just stops breathing, which is a little mysterious. It is a little puzzling, I think. In both stories, it's sort of seen as something that he has some kind of control over. He recognizes that his time has come and he should bring his life to an end.
Well, Andrew, I've learned a lot more than I once knew about Zeno. Zeno being a celebrated son of Cyprus, there's just so little that we actually know about him, and it is a shame that a number of his works never did survive. And I never realized how difficult it is to piece together what early tenets of Stoicism may have been. But it seems like a very important contribution to philosophy, and clearly it had its impact later on into the Greco-Roman world. For you, just taking your time to share with the History of Cyprus podcast about Zeno, about his later pupil, I'm very thankful for that. And Andrew, I really thank you for accepting the invitation.
Can I just add one thing? I mean, Zeno was honored in Kition with a statue in his lifetime. And whether there is a statue of him anywhere in Cyprus at the moment, I don't know. But I guess there ought to be.